I'm going to have to apologize in advance. I don't have a great microphone voice. I hope that isn't too big of a problem. But anyway, let's just get started. The Civil War. Any American knows it. However, if you ask them why the Civil War started, the answer you'll receive will likely vary. Some will say slavery, states' rights, taxes, sectionalism. I've heard someone say it started over aliens. All of these have degrees of merit, varying degrees, mind you. But the road to the Civil War is far more complicated than a few words. The ultimate goal of this video is to paint a clear, if exceedingly simplified, picture of what that road looked like. The primary themes I'd like you to keep in mind are threefold: sectionalism, fear, and the, as I've called it, the deal with it later mentality. With that being said, let's start at the very beginning, if you consider 1789 to be the beginning of anything, I guess. Part 1, the beginning of 1789. So we all know that the Constitution is the single most important piece of legislation in the United States today. However, we also know that it's not exactly airtight. It was written vaguely, intentionally so. This means, of course, that there were bound to be debates over what it actually meant. This plays out quite a few times in American history, but for our purposes, I want to look at two specific parts of it. The first is the 3/5 clause from Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. You all know it from grade school. It states, and I quote, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and including Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons." What does this mean? On a basic level, it means slaves count as 3/5 of a person in regard to the census, which was part of a very famous compromise to balance the congressional power of slave states. Now, looking at it on a deeper level, doesn't it sort of imply that slavery is a legitimate institution in the United States? The second article I'd like to look at is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. It states, as one of the many powers of Congress, and I quote, "to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by cession of particular states, and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state." In other words, Congress controls the federal capital. Now, if you read between the lines a bit, you realize that also means Congress can outlaw slavery in the capital. If you're an abolitionist, that gets you thinking. If Congress is giving themselves the power to outlaw slavery in the capital and the territories in a different clause, something they knew was too controversial to ban outright, does that mean the Constitution was intended as anti-slavery? If these two pieces of the Constitution, and way more we won't be really getting into, you can come to all sorts of conclusions about this. Did the Founding Fathers know this? Absolutely. What did they do about it? Nothing. Partially because even they didn't agree on how slavery should be dealt with, if at all. Also because they didn't want to fracture the Union right after they brought it together. They decided they'd just deal with it later. Hence what I've called the deal with it later mentality. As a hint, we'll be mentioning this again. The TLDR of all that is the groundwork is set, the Constitution is made, and you have two sides of an argument, both very passionate about their side, both insisting the Constitution agrees with them. What happens? War. Well, not yet, but eventually. That brings us to part 2, the build-up. Obviously, if we went through every single event that led to the Civil War, we would be here forever. Instead, this section is going to be a crash course of events that I feel are particularly significant and provide a sort of through line. And the very first thing to keep in mind about the 19th century is that slavery was not as in style as it was 100 years ago. American slave owners were very well aware of this, and whenever events arose that threatened their ability to keep slaves, they were terrified. The most obvious example was, of course, the Haitian Revolution, that being the first and largest successful slave revolt in history. The nuances of it deserve a discussion all on their own, but what we need to know for this is that Southern slave owners did not want the success of Haiti in achieving independence, causing their own slaves to get ideas. A good example of this is the Virginia Manumission Act of 1806. It's really difficult to find direct documentation of this act, unfortunately, but the basics is that it makes freeing a slave much, much more difficult. For example, freed slaves are legally required to leave the state, which we can see direct evidence of with the petition of freed slave Adam Barber, among many others, who did not want to uproot their entire lives for whatever reason. Many of these petitions, like Barber's, were rejected. Why? Because seeing a freed slave may give you the idea to be free yourself. Better to send them somewhere else where they won't be a bother. There were a ton of ways slave owners tried to tighten their grips on their slaves, and this is only one of them. They feared their slaves rising up and killing them, just like in Haiti. Jumping further a bit, we have a few early secession attempts. Not the big one, mind you, but South Carolina is involved, unsurprisingly. The first is the Essex-Utah, which was not by the South. I will not delve too deeply into the details, as we've already discussed this in class enough, but the relevant information is that some New England Federalists decided that they would be better off on their own. In an archived letter from major Essex-Utah figure Timothy Pickering to Massachusetts Senator and potential ally George Cabot, he writes that the people of the East cannot recycle their habits of use and interests with those of the South and the West. The latter are beginning to rule with a rod of iron. When not convenient to violate the Constitution, it must be altered, and it will be made to assume any shape as an instrument to crush the Federalists. It's also worth noting the presence of sectionalism in this document. Now, the primary distinction he makes is as Federalists, he identifies the Union as the East, South, and West. While they're all part of the United States, the various regions of the Union have distinct cultural identities. You can't help but wonder if other people looked at what Pickering was trying to do and thought, hey, maybe he has a point. Why should I let these guys tell me what to do? We'll never know how successful this Federalist Union would have been, as the entire plot was exposed in the now infamous Hartford Convention, and at the absolute worst timing in the world, since it came around right at the end of the War of 1812, meaning everyone was feeling pretty good about the state of the Union. Democracy was saved, for now. The other big secession plot I wanted to talk about was South Carolina's first big attempt to leave the Union. As a quick background, President John Quincy Adams signs off on the so-called Tariff of Abomination in 1828, which was intended to benefit northern factories, as all tariffs do. This led to counter-tariffs, and the big loser of these counter-tariffs are the South, who, as an agricultural economy, are absolutely reliant on exports. In response, an anonymous letter is sent by South Carolina titled South Carolina Exposition in Protest. One such phrase is included in it, which reads that it would seem impossible to deny the states the right of deciding on the infractions of their powers and the proper remedy to be applied for their correction. What this letter is basically advocating for is something called nullification. It gives the state the power to look at a federal law they don't like and say, nah. This isn't necessarily secession, but it's basically half a step away from it. If states gets the power to defy the federal government whenever they want, the Union's over. It'll be the Articles of Confederation all over again, and James Madison will not be there to save the day this time. To make things even worse, the anonymous writer of this proclamation, as well as the biggest supporter of South Carolina in this fiasco, is soon-to-be Vice President John C. Calhoun, who is, by the way, the most evil-looking man I've ever seen. He looks like the human embodiment of the Grinch. He continues this streak of petulance well into Jackson's presidency as well. In his famous 1831 Fort Hill address, he states that this right of interposition, thus solemnly asserted by the state of Virginia, be it called what it may, state right, veto, nullification, or by any other name, I conceive to be the fundamental principle of our system, resting on facts historically as certain as our Revolution itself, and deductions as simple and demonstrative as that of any political or moral truth whatever, and I firmly believe that on its recognition depend the stability and safety of our political institutions, end quote. Uh-oh, the Vice President just said South Carolina, and any state, has the right to nullification, and may have low-key supported secession. Luckily for the Union, South Carolina couldn't keep up this resistance forever. Jackson was ready to build an army and crush them, but a compromise is made by Henry Clay, as usual, that de-escalates the situation. The Union was saved again, but South Carolina did not forget. They tasted the sweet, sweet fruit of secession, and they wanted more. And with these big secession plots out of the way, we're free to talk about free states and slave states, probably the most famous part of the road to the Civil War. The first major act, and the big one really, is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. You all know what it is, but put extremely simply, every territory above the 3630 latitude line is going to be a free state, and every state below the 3630 latitude line is going to be a slave state. Until they aren't, but we'll get there in a second. There are three major takeaways I want us to take from this. First, what does this cause the map to look like? It gives the country two sectors, one free, one slave, a North and a South, if you will. Second, why would they do this? Why would they even care? Well, they were both terrified of each other and bought into conspiracy theories. The South believed that the North wanted to destroy slavery forever. We can see this directly with the Mississippi Declaration of Immediate Causes of Secession, where they explicitly state that a major reason was the hostility to this institution commenced before the adoption of the Constitution. On the other hand, the North bought into the slaveocracy theory, which claimed that the South was going to spread slavery everywhere, and then even the North. The Talmadge Amendment clearly states this fear, with the representative in question directly stating in his speech to Congress that it is our business, to legislate, as never to encourage, but always to control this evil. Last, but certainly not least, note that this compromise doesn't really solve the problem. Is slavery outlawed? No. Is it protected permanently? Also no. What if the territory doesn't want to be a free state, or vice versa? We don't really know. It wasn't really intended to be a catch-all solution. It was more like a Band-Aid to keep the Union together. And the Band-Aid fell apart. The Band-Aid fell apart pretty soon, unfortunately. With the fallout of the Mexican-American War, the U.S. got not one, not two, not three, but 10 states to the Union. The question is, will they be free states or slave states? The easy answer would be look to the Missouri Compromise, but not everyone was so hot on that anymore. The problem quickly escalated when California decided to jump the gun and outlaw slavery on their own. It was yet another constitutional crisis. The South made their demands, and the North made their demands. Eventually, this settles with the Compromise of 1850. This has three major parts that we'll discuss. First, it gives the Utah and New Mexico territories the right to popular sovereignty on the issues of slavery, stating that they can decide status, and I quote, as their constitution may prescribe at the time of their admission. Second, it strengthens the Fugitive Slave Act, stating, I quote, it shall be the duty of all marshals and deputy marshals to obey and execute all warrants and precepts issued under the provisions of this act, when to them directed, end quote. Lastly, it banned the slave trade in D.C., stating, and I quote, it shall not be lawful to bring into the District of Columbia any slave whatsoever for the purpose of being sold or for the purpose of being placed in a depot to be subsequently transferred to any other state or place to be sold as merchandise. And if any state shall be brought into the said district by its owner or the authority or consent of its owner, contrary to the provisions of this act, such a slave shall thereupon become liberated and free. Once again, this didn't really solve the issue. Banning the slave trade in D.C. pissed off the South, and the Fugitive Slave Act really pissed off the North, with many states just refusing to follow it outright. While it successfully placed yet another Band-Aid on the Union, consider the long-term consequences. Banning the slave trade in D.C. only further validates the idea that the North wanted to destroy slavery. D.C. was surrounded by slave states, and forcing the North to comply with the Fugitive Slave Act only further validates the idea that the South was trying to infiltrate slavery in the North. Once again, we've kicked the can down the road to be picked up at another time. But what about popular sovereignty? It seems like a pretty good idea. I mean, what's democracy without free and fair elections? Oh, if only they knew. That brings us right to part 3, the breaking point. Remember popular sovereignty? I would hope so, because I talked about it 10 seconds ago. Well, Congress liked it so much, they decided to do it again. In 1954, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which stated that, as recognized by the legislation of 1850, commonly called the Compromise Measures, is hereby declared inoperative and void. It being the true intent and meaning of this act not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States. In other words, the Missouri Compromise is gone now, reduced to atoms, as one would say. That meant everything was back on the table. But in the short term, both the North and the South had one focus, Kansas and Nebraska. If they could secure those states, they would be saved from the slaveocracy, or the destruction of slavery, depending on your perspective, at least. So what did they do? Did they allow the territories to have free and fair elections like any good republic would? Of course not. Instead, they sent people west by the thousands to skew the election. These settlers came armed, too. Naturally, what happened was violence, which came to be known as Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is essentially the preview to the Civil War. All things considered, bleeding Kansas was not all that bloody, with estimates rounding up to 100 on the far side. What was more important, however, is that it was Northerner killing Southerner, Southerner killing Northerner, brother killing brother, Americans killing fellow Americans. The most infamous event, by far, is the Pottawatomie Wheat Creek Massacre, I can't spell that, enacted by one John Brown. How you saw this man was entirely dependent on who you were. If you were an average Northerner, John Brown was a crazy guy who just made matters a lot worse between the North and the South. If you were an abolitionist or a slave, John Brown was a hero doing what nobody else wanted to, if a little extreme. But if you were a Southerner, John Brown was the confirmation of all your fears. The issue of Kansas and Nebraska continued up until the Civil War, but for the Union, it was the beginning of the end. And the single event I believe that made the Civil War inevitable in the following few years was unequivocally the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. The culprit was, you guessed it, John Brown. The event itself was a complete failure. In essence, Brown attempted to raid an armory and start a slave revolt and was captured. What truly made this a disaster, however, was the reaction. Many Republicans, especially future President Abraham Lincoln, maintained that they condemned the actions of John Brown, with Lincoln himself stating that John Brown was no Republican, and you have failed to implicate a single Republican in this Harper's Ferry enterprise. But the South was not listening. What if John Brown was only the beginning? What if John Brown was the precursor to a massive slave rebellion? What if the North was planning invasion? By 1860, it was obvious that a number of Southern states were already considering secession. They just needed the excuse. And when Republican Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election, that was all they needed. South Carolina became the first to secede in the same year, barely a month after the election. The floodgates were open. Several other states, particularly in the Deep South, seceded. And in the ultimate final act that sealed the fate of the Union as they knew it, President Buchanan looked at the ongoing crisis and says, nah. By the time Lincoln took office some months later, it was already too late. The newly formed Confederacy was arming itself rapidly, and more states seceded by the month. The Civil War was, by this point, completely inevitable. Now, as for our conclusion, it's important to keep in mind that this was all a very brief crash course on the road to the Civil War. The events discussed were heavily simplified, and this was merely an overview of the general concepts that I felt led to the war. The overall summary here is going to be 1, the deal with it later mentality. Started by the Constitution itself and carried through with the numerous compromises created the environment for the situation to escalate. 2, developments throughout the 19th century, both intentional and perhaps unintentional, led to sectionalism between the North and the South as distinct cultural identities arose. 3, a mutual fear between the North and the South led to conflict arising where there didn't really need to be any. This eventually boiled over into secession most directly. These are by far not the only reasons for the Civil War, of course, but they are, in my personal opinion, the most impactful. With that being said, that's all I really have for you today. For more information on this fascinating topic, I strongly recommend Dr. Totten, the best professor at U of A. Please give me a good grade. See you when I see you.